Welcome to this week's discussion of parties and interest groups. There are a fair amount of slides here, so feel free to break this up as necessary, but I hope to hit the high points and let the reading kind of stand on its own. So the first thing that I'm going to go through is not kind of the nuts and bolts like we usually do, but rather some theories, and in particular one big theory about how parties in the U.S. work. And this is particularly pertinent when there is an election going on. So you'll often hear, is this a realigning election? What that means, it has to do with something called realignment theory or party realignment theory. And this is a theory that says that each era has a stable party alignment, that parties are aligned ideologically and socially in a certain way, and then you have a critical election which changes everything. And this may be because a third party splintered off of one of the major two, or because a new group of people entered the electorate. Either some people came of age, or there was an influx of immigration, etc. So you have stable party alignments that are broken up when there are factions within a party, and then there's a critical election that changes the alignments. And we tend to look at these not because you want to memorize every detail of every alignment, but you want to understand that this is kind of a cyclical thing. This happens over and over again. So if you look, here is at the bottom of this slide, there is a brief listing of some of the eras of partisan politics in our country's history. And, for a long time I used to break these down to students, and there is some merit as well in that, telling people, why the alignments changed and why they stayed the same in certain places. But for the most part, if you look at it, they tend to speak for themselves. And it usually happens about every 30 to 40 years when you have a new generation coming of age and an old one leaving the electorate because of death or disability. The question then becomes whether this is still happening today. Some people say that it is, some people say that it's not. Some people say there was a sixth era that had ended, and maybe 2008 was a realigning election, or 1994. Sometimes it's one of those things that's kind of hard to see until you're out of it, though. But it is one way in which to frame our discussion of party politics, because the parties do influence how government works. So the parties are organized themselves from a national level to a state level and then a local level. So on a national level, the machinery includes the National Committee, which is the governing body, the National Chair, which is the leader of the party machine, the National Convention, which occurs regularly to nominate candidates and approve the platform of the party. And the platform is a long written document that is the official ideology of the party. It's parties issue stances on certain topics, theories and proposals for where we should go from here. But not everybody adheres to the national platform, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then the state and local organization of the party usually follows what the national party has done. So we have two main party paradigms, and this, for a minute, we're going to step outside of the U.S. and compare ourselves in comparison to some other, particularly Western European nations for this exercise. And as is noted up in the corner there, a paradigm is a universally accepted and irreconcilable theory about how the world or a piece of it works. So these two paradigms help us understand why our parties act the way they do. One of the most frequent questions I get from students is why do we only have two parties? And then after that, why do the parties, do they even matter? And they do, but they matter for different reasons here than they do elsewhere. So if we look at ourselves, we fall into this rational, efficient paradigm. And rational, efficient paradigm is a pragmatic paradigm. It's a pragmatic way of governing where the parties are used for tools to win elections. They're not used for tools to make policy changes, but rather tools to win elections. Partisans can differ on issues. You can have a Democrat in Louisiana that votes very differently than a Democrat in Michigan. But there is some overlap between the parties. So there are some issue areas where things are the same, believe it or not. And in these types of systems, we vote for individual candidates. We don't necessarily vote for the party label. The majority party might not have power of all three branches of government, or two, including the legislative and executive, but still must answer in some respect to the minority party. They can't govern without them. And they're only one way of influencing government, which means there are other things like interest groups and different players, media, etc. And finally, party membership is really not easy to define. When someone says they're a card-carrying member of the party, that's actually pretty rare, that someone pays their dues to belong to the party. That's not necessarily rare in other countries. And in other countries, sometimes they use what is called the party government paradigm. And the party government paradigm is more ideological. It's an ideological way of governing where the parties are used to make policy changes. So if the main goal can be summarized, for the United States in the rational efficient paradigm, the main goal is to win elections and win power, and then to make policy changes if possible. In the party government paradigm, the main goal is to make policy changes, not necessarily to win the next election after that. And in part, that's because parliamentary systems don't have regular elections like we do. But in part, it signals a very different idea of what parties should be doing as a part of government. So the party paradigm is a tool to help define what parties do within that system. And what should become clear of this is that parties in our system are specifically engineered and motivated to win elections, not necessarily to effectuate policy change, which is why I mentioned earlier, not all people in the party adhere to the party platform. You have very different, let's say, Democrats from one area of the country to the next. That is not the same as it is in other countries. When you are part of a party, you are part of that platform. You are part of that policy movement. That's not necessarily true here in the United States. So why are there only two major parties in America? Well, people have varying explanations for this. One is that there's this explanation that there's a natural dualism in democratic institutions, that when you're voting for things, two choices is usually what you're voting between, a yes or a no, or an A and a B. Another explanation is socialization. In other words, we have done it for so long in this way that it's really hard to change the way we do things. And there is some merit to that. It's very hard to change habits. But you have to add in some other things, including institutional and legal explanations. So the legal explanation first would be that getting on the ballot in a primary is easy to select primary candidates in terms of how you want to do that. But getting on a general election ballot, especially in the state of Michigan, is actually quite hard. So your party can only get recognized if they can win office. And if they can't win office regularly, they have to get petitions signed and filed, and there are deadlines, and people can challenge signatures. That's very hard to do. And it's very hard to sustain that for any length of time. Institutional changes are things like the Electoral College, which lends itself to a two-party system because splitting that three ways has usually led to contested elections. Single-member districts, so we elect people, winner takes all in that district, as opposed to having a more proportional representation system. So we don't have a voting at large, which means unless you win an entire district or an entire state, your party gets no say. Your party could have 49% of the population in every single state, but never win the party or the presidency. And so our institutions being set up like that actually lend themselves to only having two parties. So is this a good way to do things? Well, the pros are actually surprisingly heavy in this category. It's predictable and stable. So one of the things that people don't tend to realize if they've grown up in the U.S. is that handing over power, especially presidential power, is predictable, stable. You can't imagine a situation where one president refuses to leave office. And democracy can be pretty messy, but parties help clean it up some. They help refine our choices and at least label them for us. When the constituencies change, it gives us an incentive to change the party within the parties, and there's accountability through regular elections. So, unlike other systems, elections are regular, you know when they're going to come up, and you know you can vote people out. They also help find policy solutions to general problems. So they take kind of that diverse view of the public and boil it down a little bit more. And this is something that I think Madison, even though he wasn't a big fan of political parties when he was writing the Federalist Papers, would probably agree that it was necessary at least. And it helps us narrow the field of candidates. Now, during an election cycle, particularly one where there are candidates whom we don't like, this is kind of hard to imagine that parties help us narrow this down. So, for example, in the 2016 presidential election, the GOP started off with about 17 potential candidates. But they narrow them down as time goes on, and that's not something that the general public has to do, because if you could imagine a ballot where we didn't narrow things down, you'd have 40 candidates on a ballot and have to select from them, which means we'd have to have a lot of runoff elections and the like. The cons, though, are usually what people focus on, and it's not hard to see why. It's too predictable, and it's too beholden to outdated interests. The Electoral College we'll talk about a little more when we talk about elections, but it doesn't really serve any modern interests. Parties can suffer from the same problems as large bureaucracies, so red tape and the like. And in the U.S., they're focused on winning power, not necessarily on effectuating change. So what does that mean? That means our interests aren't necessarily heard. And when you have divided government, where one party holds one branch, like the presidency, and the other party holds Congress, or vice versa, it creates an incentive to stall rather than to act. And I'll let you think if there's any neutral points. Maybe some of this balances each other out. Maybe we're willing to make those trade-offs. But these are definitely criticisms and points in favor of the system as it is. So the minority parties or third parties. Why don't we see third parties raised to power? Well, we talked about some of these reasons why there are only two parties. But maybe talking about the types of third parties might help explain that too. So there are four general types of third parties. There's ideological parties. These are people who feel like the two major parties don't adequately deal with their range of issues in society. So these are usually parties that have a broad platform. They talk about multiple issue areas. They're usually significantly smaller than the major two parties, but they're long-term. So the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, the Socialist Party, these parties have been around for a long time. They don't have many electoral victories, but they do have kind of a sustaining core group. Then you have single-issue parties. These are people who feel like the major parties are ignoring a key issue, so they form their own political party to advocate for it. This is different than an interest group. This is a full political party just to get people on the ballot to effectuate change in one area. So the Free Soil Party that wanted to abolish slavery in new states was an example of that. And now we have the U.S. Marijuana Party, and during the teens and 20s we had the Prohibition Party. Economic protest parties. These are people who feel that the economic system needs to be reformed. And so this is a little bit different because we hear that coming from some of the main parties, and sometimes these ideas are co-opted out of third parties as well. But these are parties that focus primarily on economic issues rather than a range of economics and social and political issues. And then we have splinter parties. Parties that are formed within another party or by major players in another party, and then split off. So Ross Perot and his Reform Party, or the best example of that is Teddy Roosevelt, who split off from the Republicans to create the Bull Moose Party, which, by the way, is the best party name of all time. And so Teddy Roosevelt being kind of a key figure, and usually it happens when you have someone who's a major player and can do this, pulls support from the Republican Party and creates a substantial third party, but it was only for a short period of time. Despite the fact that it's a cool party name, it did not last very long. So when we think about these things in modern terms, often we see things like the Tea Party or the Occupy movement, and are these third parties? Are they just movements? Will they ever solidify into parties? Um, at this point in time, it doesn't look like they're going to. When I first started asking this question, the Tea Party had the potential of it. The Occupy movement, probably not so much. But usually what happens with these ideas is that they're co-opted by the major parties. They're kind of refined, boiled down, and co-opted by the major parties, and they end up changing what the two major parties do. The benefits of having third parties are things like they present these new ideas of dealing with issues. They present sustained attention to specific issues. And they give a home to people who feel like they're outside of the two-party system. But probably the biggest benefit is that they keep the major parties up to date and on their toes. And so the major parties, Democrats and Republicans, have to either adopt these issue stances, co-opt them in some way, or hope they go away. But it's difficult to raise money and get publicly funded. You have to meet a certain threshold for that. It's not easy to be successful in our system for longer periods of time. The media doesn't focus on you. We have winner-take-all single-member districts. So instead of your district being represented by multiple members who represent the different political ideas, you get one person in your district, which sounds funny, but if you were to take comparative politics, which I encourage you to do, you would find out that that's not actually a common way of doing things, because it makes a lot of people feel left out. And some states do not allow third parties on the ballot for general elections unless they collect enough signatures, and that can be a very difficult way of getting things done. So party identification has declined over time. Parties used to be the main source of information on politics, on government jobs, on networking, and they actually have a lot more competition these days. We have the internet. We have not just technology, but we have different networks through education and the like. So people tend to feel like they're independent, though most of us have party affiliations in our head. But we reject party labels as kind of a systematic way of doing things. But party ideology has actually solidified. The parties are further apart than they have ever been. You can call this polarization. And part of that has to do with the fact that we have safe districts, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks with gerrymandering and safe districts, that produce more ideologically liberal or conservative representatives who don't tend to trade off or be moderate at all. And there are new issues that divide the parties over the past few decades, and there are few ways to find common ground on some of these issues. So finally, we have to talk about interest groups. Interest groups are groups that collect people and money around a single issue or a group of similar issues in order to effectuate change by influencing government. So they do things like produce papers, do research, lobby, which is the key thing, and they do this in response to societal change or in response to other groups doing something on the opposite side of an issue. We all belong to or are represented by some interest group. In fact, the University of Michigan has its own lobbyists. The University of Michigan-Flint has one lobbyist of its own. Because by definition, all of the organizations out there somehow claim us as their members. Whether we're card-carrying, dues-paying members or not really doesn't matter. If they can claim all students or all people who have car insurance or all people who live in the state of Michigan, etc., so on and so forth, is an issue group out there that somehow claims your membership. And so they do that when they're trying to influence government. And the biggest way of influencing government is lobbying. Lobbying is not all bad. Lobbying can be good, but it has a dark side, and you can see why in a minute. Lobbying generally is attempts by groups and representatives of groups to influence the decisions of public officials. So this can mean just having meetings with public officials and doing position papers and providing statistics. But it could also mean drafting legislation, doing costly research, meeting with elected officials in sort of a fancier way, like a really nice dinner somewhere, engaging in litigation on behalf of their members, and direct use of media. One of the key elements of this lobbying is political action committees who can donate you can donate a lot to super PACs. You can donate unlimited funds to super PACs without having to disclose those funds in many ways. And those funds can be spent on behalf of a candidate. And so there starts to have kind of a dark, or at least the potential of some problematic things. But lobbying itself, so you think about all these terrors of lobbying, like you can give someone a trip to Hawaii for voting the way you want on their bill. We've tried to clamp down on it. So you can see here that there are some attempts at reining in lobbyists. The problem is it's hard to cut out the good lobbying from the bad lobbying. And quite honestly, whenever we write our congressperson or meet with our congressperson or call their office or email them or sign one of those change.org petitions that emails our representative, that actually is a form of lobbying. So how do you cut that off from what professional lobbyists do? And we've attempted to do that, but whether we've done a good job of it is another question. And so interest groups have a good side. They allow us to have a voice. Many of them organize citizen education events and lobbying days. They can help provide voters with information shortcuts, so you know if you are a very big Second Amendment person, you can look up the NRA's grades of legislators and things like that. They provide valuable information and research to elected officials as well. And they allow citizens access to government actors that they might not otherwise have. But the money involved can be a corrupting factor. The influence is usually larger with certain groups, the NRA being one of them, than it probably should be. And the media focus gets blurred. You don't know where the lines are. So interest groups and political parties can both be good, bad, and in between, and it's kind of finding the balance in that. And how do you cut the bad parts out without also cutting out the good parts? That becomes somewhat difficult to do, both with interest groups and political parties. So this week's supplemental reading is the American Political Science Association's Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System. This is actually not a current document, even though the APSA is very much a current organization. This was drafted and published in 1950. And it was a call to both parties that they needed to change in order for them to be good for the American electorate. The odd thing is that they've changed and it hasn't necessarily been a good thing. So the APSA said that the role of the parties is to refine public attitudes, advocate certain policies, and effectuate representation. And that a two-party system is probably not the best way to do this. We should have more choices. But if we're going to have a two-party system, the parties must be able to do these two things: introduce policy programs and effectuate such programs. But the dangers of having a really stagnant two-party system really challenged the APSA to write this. And they said these dangers are as follows. The two-party system, they found, was inadequate to prevent good programs from failing because they couldn't get public support behind them. In other words, two parties are too focused on fighting for their piece of the pie rather than effectuating change. Second, people shift responsibility to the president in lieu of having strong parties. In other words, if you had strong parties, you might actually think Congress can get something done, so you'd focus your attention there. But since we don't tend to have strong parties, or at least we didn't at the time, the president was being given too much power. The two parties that are left will no longer be respected and will disintegrate. They are no longer kind of standard bearers for those political ideas. And finally, the inability of the two parties for consistent action in meaningful programs would allow extremists to take over the political realm and ignore the public good. So there are two interpretations of what has happened since this paper. One interpretation is that the parties actually listened, and we became polarized in a way that we actually presented distinct issue disagreements. So the parties used to agree on a lot. After this was published, after in particular the civil rights movement and the party realignments in the 1970s, parties didn't really agree on a whole lot of anything anymore. And that's certainly true today. So one could claim that we did this and it didn't work. On the other hand, you can claim that we didn't do this. We did this primarily through distinct issue areas, but never strengthening parties. And so now people argue that the parties are not strong enough to withstand a challenge from a extremist candidate or group, and that they are vulnerable. Uh, I probably would find more intuitive stock in the last one than in the first one, but it is something that's out there. And what I want you to take away from this piece is that this is something that we've been talking about for quite some time. This is not a problem where political parties used to be good earlier in my lifetime and now they're not. This is obviously an issue where things have changed over time. Sure, there are different players and different problems, but we have always had an issue with the two-party system, and whether we've ever solved it or not, or whether we could ever solve it or not, is something that's up for grabs.